Hello, welcome to the read aloud for lesson 3, section 11, 3.11, Nationalism at Home and Abroad, Foreign Affairs. Was this an era of good feelings or not? The War of 1812 may have been against the British, but it also brought attacks, frequently led by Andrew Jackson, on Native Americans. During and after the war, Old Hickory battled the Creek tribes, the Seminole tribes, and any other tribes who resisted American territorial expansion. Expansion continued in other ways too. The Adams-Onis Treaty settled boundaries with Spain, while the Monroe Doctrine warned Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It was a time of war and peace, politics and pride. Okay, goals for this lesson. Some of these were goals that we had in the last lesson, so I'm not going to read through all those because that'll take a lot of time. And lesson resources, grab them for your reading guide and lesson answer key. And let's begin. Okay, we need to start with page 252 to 257. So let's get to our reading. 252, starting with the Supreme Court and federal power. Under the leadership of Chief Justice John Marshall, in 1803, the Supreme Court had claimed the right of judicial review, the power to decide whether laws passed by Congress and the states were constitutional. In the following years, the Supreme Court handed down a number of important decisions that limited states' rights and strengthened the role of the federal government. In 1819, the Marshall Court ruled in the case of McCulloch v. Maryland. The state of Maryland had attempted to tax the Second Bank of the United States, an institution of the federal government. The bank had refused to pay a tax to a state. Chief Justice John Marshall, speaking for the Supreme Court, ruled that because the power to tax involves the power to destroy, the state had no right to tax a legitimate federal institution. The justices limited states' rights in other ways, as well. In the Trustees of Dartmouth College versus Woodward, 1819, the court ruled that a state could not interfere with a corporate charter. In Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824, Marshall struck down an attempt by the New York legislature to ensure a steamboat monopoly between New York and New Jersey. The Chief Justice ruled that the federal government alone could regulate navigation since it was part of interstate commerce. States could not set up economic barriers to competition in interstate commerce. In these and other cases, Marshall asserted the strength of the national government. Native American law says United States gains. Because hickory is one of the hardest kinds of wood, they called him Old Hickory, an appropriate nickname since toughness defined Andrew Jackson, who would become the 7th President of the United States. Growing up on the frontier, Jackson had a rough childhood. He never knew his father, who died in an accident before his birth. He became an orphan at 14 when his mother succumbed to cholera. As a youngster, he battled British troops in the backwoods. A tall, wiry stick of a man, Jackson wore his scars with pride. He possessed an indomitable will. Jackson was capable of extreme brutality. During the War of 1812, he battled the Creek Indians in the Mississippi Valley. At one point, in retaliation for a Creek attack on U.S. forces, he ordered the killing of about 900 Creek warriors at Horseshoe Bend. He then forced the Creeks to hand over 23 million acres to the United States. The Treaty of Fort Jackson, signed in 1814, resulted in the loss of more than half the territory controlled by the Creek Nation. Jackson then turned on his Cherokee allies and dismissed their complaints by saying, "No confidence can be placed in the honesty of an Indian." The Seminole Wars. At the War of 1812, Jackson battled the Seminole Indians in the Spanish-controlled Florida. The Seminoles had challenged the authority of the United States by crossing the border and killing settlers and by harboring escaped slaves. In 1818, Jackson led a force of Tennessee militia into Florida and wiped out numerous Seminole villages. Furthermore, without any orders, he raided and seized 2 Spanish forts. A few politicians expressed concern over the ambitious, hard-hearted general. Henry Clay warned that his victory represented a triumph of the military over civil authority. The Seminole Wars highlighted some important developments. Spain no longer had control of Florida. The United States did not recognize the local Indians' right to self-government or their claims to the land, and Andrew Jackson was a force to be reckoned with. The acquisition of Florida. At the time, President Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, son of the second president, was negotiating with Spain for the acquisition of Florida by the United States. On George Washington's birthday, February 22, 1819, Adams signed one of the most advantageous treaties in American history, called the Adams-Onis Treaty, after Luis de Onis, then Spain's ambassador to the United States. According to the treaty, the United States gave up any claims to Spanish Texas, but acquired Florida, which at the time included the southern part of what would become Alabama and Mississippi. The treaty set a boundary between New Spain and the United States, going northwest from the Gulf of Mexico and then along the 42nd parallel from the western side of the Louisiana Purchase to the Pacific Ocean. For a mere $5 million paid to Spain, the United States now stretched from sea to sea. The nation had direct ocean access to Asia and much more room for expansion. The Monroe Doctrine. The United States was also able to negotiate the Adams-Onis Treaty because Spain was no longer the world power it had once been. By 1819, Spain's hold over what remained of its new world empire was shaky indeed. In 1810, Spain's largest colony, Mexico, began a campaign for freedom from Spanish rule. Shortly after the ratification of the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1821, Mexico won its independence. Meanwhile, Simón Bolívar, Jose de San Martin, and other revolutionary leaders began their successful efforts to free much of Latin America from Spanish rule. President Monroe praised the Latin American colonies that followed the glorious example of the United States, but at first he did not take any action to support their independence movements. Despite the nation's growing nationalism and economic strength, the United States at this time was still a relatively weak power on the international scale. Scene. Ignoring pressure from Henry Clay, Monroe withheld official recognition of Latin American revolutionaries until it became clear that Spain's hold on South America was all but gone. And then you can read here Latin American independence movements, Simón Bolívar, and its effect on Latin American countries. And then here is the Monroe Doctrine in the blue box, the actual text excerpts of it. But let's continue reading here. In March 1822, the President asked Congress to recognize the new Latin American republics, including Colombia, Mexico, Chile, and Argentina. The next year, he was also willing to even go further and affirm the role of the United States in influencing the destiny of the Western Hemisphere. Guided by Secretary of State Adams, Monroe presented a new statement of American foreign policy in his December 1823 State of the Union address. The new policy, known as the Monroe Doctrine, asserted that American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European power. In part, the Monroe Doctrine was responding to reports that the Holy Alliance of European monarchs wanted to reassert control over the new Latin American countries, and that the Tsar of Russia aimed at further colonization in the Pacific Northwest. Secretary Adams wanted to make a strong statement that the United States would oppose any European colonial presence on the American side of the Atlantic. Monroe agreed. According to the Monroe Doctrine, while the United States would keep its hands off any existing European colonies, it would resist any European attempts to set up new colonies in the Americas or to interfere with Latin American affairs. At the time, the United States did not have the military strength to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. Still, the doctrine expressed America's confident nationalism, and it continued to shape American foreign policy for many years to come. The exuberant nationalism of the era of good feelings did not last. The vision of America's unified and unstoppable wave of national growth crashed into the reality of the Panic of 1819, which demonstrated that economic expansion cannot go on forever. The crisis leading to the Missouri Compromise revealed sharp sectional differences between those who profited from slavery and those who feared its expansion. Both events led to bitter arguments over the role of the federal government should have in people's lives. Though Monroe won re-election in 1820 almost unopposed, by the time he left office in 1825, the spirit of the War of 1812 had receded, leaving his Democratic-Republican Party permanently fractured. Partisanship returned with a vengeance. Most alarmingly, the debates over federal power and the expansion of slavery continued and grew even more heated. Yet despite the gathering clouds, the nationalism of the period left behind something profound. The belief that Americans shared a great collective destiny persisted. From the Madisonian platform to the American system to the Monroe Doctrine, this era witnessed a deep and abiding confidence in the power of free people to shape their own future. Okay, complete the leaps and bounds activity. So make sure you've gone through your reading guide and your lesson answer key, and then look at this leaps and bound activity. The period from 1800 to 1825 brought numerous boundary changes in the United States. Ohio, Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Maine, and Missouri became states, joining the original 13, along with Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The United States purchased Louisiana Territory, gained land from Spain, and reached an important agreement about the non-slave status of future states. Track and visualize these boundary changes by completing the map of the United States. Okay, so you have a word bank here, and you have to, I can't drag it. You have to actually type it in. Okay, let's do that then. Oh, incorrect, so it's spelled wrong. Let's try that again. There we go. Now it's right. Okay, then we got to put in more states. And finally, MISSISSIPPI. Okay. And then here are the map of all of them completed. Everything colored out so you can see that. Okay, so let's close out of this activity. And continuing on here, Chapter 10 highlights. So you know there's going to be a quiz here at the end. Following the War of 1812, a Greek revival in architecture and culture reflected American pride and democratic nationalism. In 1817, James Monroe became the last of the Revolutionary presidents, bringing an era of good feelings to the nation. Shipping, manufacturing, and agriculture grew, and New York Governor DeWitt Clinton won funding to build the Erie Canal. Between 1800 and 1820, the population quadrupled, thousands moved west, and 6 new states entered the Union. Interest in religion surged during the Second Great Awakening. The 1820 Missouri Compromise admitted Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and forbade slavery north of 3630. Henry Clay described a series of federal improvements that included roads, canals, tariffs, and a second bank of the United States as the American system. John C. Calhoun and Daniel Webster dominated Congress. A weak economy and banking crisis led to the Panic of 1819. Chief Justice John Marshall and the Supreme Court ruled on issues of federal power and economic growth. Andrew Jackson's continuing battles with the Creeks, Cherokees, Seminoles, and others caused carnage across the American Indian lands. The 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty allowed the acquisition of Florida and established a new boundary at the 42nd parallel. The 1823 Monroe Doctrine asserted that Americans were neutral and not open to colonization by European powers. So complete the quiz and then you're done with lesson 3.11. Good luck!